Hello again, Zach Wilson, Hood County Chess Club here, continuing our series in the endgame with kings and pawns. And I'm hoping that from our previous videos on opposition and the rectangular method and distant opposition, that when you look at this, you recognize it instantly as a draw. It doesn't even matter whose turn it is to move here. If it were black's turn to move, he'd simply seize the opposition. If it's white's turn to move, his only option is to move the pawn. And no matter what happens, black stays in front of the pawn, preventing the pawn ever from queening here. Seizing the opposition. If you don't know what the opposition is, please go watch our two-part series on opposition and distant opposition with the rectangular method. And this is the position that I want us to look at in our next slide in just a moment. But in case you don't know what's going to happen next, the pawn goes forward, black steps in front, and if white moves away from the pawn, black captures white's pawn and it's a draw, or white can step behind the pawn to save it. Unfortunately, it also leads to a stalemate, as you can see with all the red arrows. Black has no legal moves, but is also not in check, and that is a stalemate. But this is what I want you to remember. So let's go to our first endgame tactic, the fox in the chicken coop. So in this, we notice that this same position is here. We know it's going to lead to a draw, except there are other pawns on the board. And the pawns themselves are completely locked up unless a king is able to come over and help out. Well, we know the black king is not going to come over and help out because it's too busy protecting against this pawn here from queening here, and we certainly don't want white to get a queen. So white is going to push the position as far as he can. Black's fighting for that draw. And here we are at that critical position from just a moment ago, where white is going to make a choice to become a fox in the chicken coop. He starts to head over towards the pawns. Well, black, unfortunately, has to take care of the passed pawn, or else it's going to become a queen. So black cannot afford for this pawn to march forward, so he has to deal with it. This gives white time. That pawn is gone, but so are black's pawns. And there's nothing black can do about it. And from here, it's super easy. White claims the queening square. No way is black getting inside the bridge. And this pawn is going to become a queen. So we can look at that again really quickly. White pushes black up the board. And at this critical moment, abandons his passed pawn. Black is able to get it, but it's too late because this pawn is going to queen. So this is the idea of the fox in the chicken coop. And we're going to remember that. But first, we need to look at another concept called the deep freeze. Okay, so now we're going to learn about a concept called the deep freeze. I put the kings down here in the corner so we can kind of ignore them for a moment because we're only interested in the pawn formations themselves. So in the deep freeze, what we see here is black has two pawns versus white's one pawn. However, all white has to do is push, and now black's pawn is stuck. There's nothing that this pawn can do to proceed because one white pawn can stop two black pawns, and here's why. If black decided to move his pawn and white captures, you'll notice that white is only 2 squares away from queening, while black's pawn is 5 squares away from queening, so white is going to win the race. Therefore, since black can't push this pawn, white only needs one pawn to blockade 2 pawns. And this is a very useful idea. Now, if we go over to the other side of the board over here, we can see that if it were black's turn to move, he too could simply freeze out the white pawns. However, let's give black a nonsense move here to move on. What if it were white's turn to move? And white simply moves his pawn forward. Well, what's black to do? If black comes forward, white can either move forward and become a queen, or white could capture and become a queen. And depending on where the other pieces are on the board at the time, that would help you make your decision. But if black makes another nonsense move, say he's got pieces on the board and refuses to move, well then white has an easy job here. He just pushes the pawn, and again, if black ignores it, white's off to the races. And if he moves another piece, white's off to the races. And if he captures, Well, white can either move past or capture. And again, depending on the pieces and where they are on the board, that would help you make that decision based on whether you wanted your pawn to queen here or here. You can see he could either march forward or he could capture and go that way. So let's take a look over here now. And what move should white make? Well, let's make sure that it is white's turn to move. I hope you can recognize by now that the blunder would be if white moved here, because all black has to do is cause the deep freeze. But if white makes the correct move, then there's absolutely nothing black can do, as we saw over on this side. So hopefully you have an idea of how the deep freeze works. This is what it looks like. This is the position you're going for. And let's take a look at when we combine the deep freeze with the fox in the chicken coop. So here we're wondering, where should white move? And I hope you recognize that that is the wrong move for white. This is a blunder. He's allowing the deep freeze to happen. And so all black has to do is complete the deep freeze. And white doesn't really have the option of pushing the pawn here, because if black takes, then he's a lot closer to queening than white. He's going to win the race. So play would proceed with white trying to stop the promotion of this black pawn over here. And off he goes. We can tell right now that this is a draw. If black was to move here and white was to seize the opposition, this would continue all the way down the board. White would get his draw, except that black becomes a fox. White has to take care of this pawn and stop it from queening. And there goes the king, running for those chickens, gobbling them up. And here we notice that black is now going to guarantee a win. And we know this because in the video on opposition, the critical squares are here. If black can get his king into any one of those squares in front of his own pawn, 2 squares ahead of the pawn and on either side, then he's going to be able to force it. So the best that white can do is simply move here, and black still gets into those critical squares, and we can see he's going to get the queening square here, and the pawn is going to queen. It doesn't matter if white tries to move up the board. The black pawn will move, which checks the king and is protected by black's king. So white tries to step in front, black seizes the opposition, and it doesn't matter. If white tries here, black gets the queening square. If white tries here, black gets the queening square. There's just nothing that white can do. This queen is coming, and it's all done. So I hope you could see here that the move that white needed to make was h4. Because now there's nothing that can happen. This pawn can't move. So either the king has to move or the black pawn has to move. If the black pawn moves, I think we can tell right away that that queen is coming. And the main reason for that is that black's king is outside of the queening square. And so we're going to talk about outside the square here in just a moment. Let's go to tactical bomb number 1. So here we are. Black has already achieved a deep freeze. White is fighting for a draw. And if we play normally here, white trying to secure this draw, well, the problem is that black's king could go over and become a fox in the chicken coop. And I think we can see here that there's nothing white can do to stop black from getting to the critical squares and queening. So black's feeling pretty good about himself. He's considering that this is already won. The problem is white has a tactical bomb. And here it is. Can you guess what the move is? G5. Because now, if black takes, white's pawn is off to the races, this queen is coming, and this king is too far away. There's nothing that he can do. He can try all he wants, but that queen is coming. And if we go back to that beginning position, white should be able to recognize that this move is an option because black's king is outside the square. So what does that mean, outside the square? Well, let's take a look. So here I've got just 2 kings and 2 pawns. This isn't really a game of who's going to win. It's just 2 separate examples of outside the square. So the first thing I want to show you is white's threat is queening here. And black, to know if he can catch up with him, has to draw a square. So the square is very simple. You draw a line for where white's pawn is going to queen. Then you draw a diagonal line to the edge of the board towards the king. Let's complete that box. There's our square, and we'll get rid of that line there. You'll notice black's king is outside the square. What that means is that if white's pawn moves and black tries to chase it down, black is still outside the square. He's never going to catch him. And there's our queen. Now, had it been black's turn to move, and black was able to take this step here, at that point, black would be inside the square and would be able to catch him. Let's see what that would look like. We'll make a nonsense move for white so that it's black's turn. He steps inside the square. Pawn runs, steps inside the square. Pawn runs, steps inside the square. White temporarily gets his queen, and black is able to capture it. So as we can see, it's all about drawing the square and seeing if the king can get inside of it. We'll notice over here with black's pawn, that white's king is already inside the square. So it doesn't even matter if it's black's turn to move. So let's give black the move here. White can stay inside the square, and even though he temporarily gets his queen, off he goes. So let's go back to that previous tactical bomb here. White is wondering if he should move this pawn to break the deep freeze. And the truth is, if he moves that pawn, let's move that pawn so we can visualize it. We'll draw a couple of squares. This pawn here has this square, and this king is obviously outside of it, and even if he makes a move, he can't get inside of it. So I think it should be even more obvious that this pawn's square is even further away, and still the black king cannot get inside of it. So recognizing that, yes, white should make the break that he wants, on the deep freeze. And so again, if black tries to enter the square, white pushes, and there's just no way. Or if black had captured, and this pawn moves, again, I think we can tell pretty simply that he's outside the square. Okay, so let's go on to tactical bomb number 2. Again, we have a draw coming up down here, and we have some pawns faced off. And so white wants to become a fox in the chicken coop. And he's thinking, well, if I just take off, then I'm going to come over here and gobble up all these pawns. We'll let black take care of this one, while white comes over and eats up all of these pawns. And then someone over here is going to become a queen down here. The problem for white is that black has a tactical bomb. Can you see the move? B3. And from here, it does not matter what white does. Maybe you've seen this before in another tactical video, but let's take a look at all the options. If white pushes, black simply captures. Okay, well, what if white pushes the other way? Black simply captures. Okay, well then, what if white captures? It's very important that you know what to do here if you're the black player. See if you can figure out the move. Pause the video if you need to, and in just a moment, I'm going to show you what the move is. Here it is, the tactical bomb. Think of this as a square. If you find yourself in this position and you don't remember which of these two pawns to move, complete this little square. So any comes completing the square. And now, no matter what white does, the queen is definitely going to come. If white captures, black moves his other pawn, and nothing's stopping him. And this king is so far outside the square, it's ridiculous. Okay, so then what happens if white captures, hoping that he's going to go for a pawn? Well, black captures and is going to win the race. And what if the king just tries to be a fox in the chicken coop? Black again wins the race because this king is really outside the square here. Okay, well, what if instead white tries to capture this way? Can you see the move that black should make? That's right. Finish that square. Here it is, 4 pawns all together. He steps into the little cove there, and again, the same thing happens if he captures. The same thing happens if he tries to race, and the same thing happens if the king tries to step more closely. He's just not going to catch up. So that's a really fun tactical exercise to work on in the end game. But that gives you the ideas of the deep freeze, the fox and the chicken coop, putting them together, being able to calculate if the king is outside the square so that you can promote your pawn. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. Please subscribe to our channel, visit us on Facebook, and like our page for Hood County Chess Club. Until next time, I'm Zach Wilson. We'll see you again real soon.